Jocelyn grew up in the shadow of Dominic Tech, her father's tiny electronics repair shop, where she spent hours under dim lights, tinkering with machines to escape the pain of losing her mother. 10 years later, with trembling hands on her mother's old workbench, she transformed it into a $50 million tech empire, a feat no one expected from the quiet girl her father had overlooked. But that success unveiled a dark secret. The Pandora's box her family had kept hidden was about to burst open. As her father's laughter echoed alongside her sister Mahina under the dazzling gala lights, Jocelyn didn't know that night would change everything. A secret from the past and a promise to her mother would thrust her into an unrelenting battle. Mahina, Jocelyn's older sister, was once just a name in phone conversations, a figure in glamorous photos sent back from the big city, where she chased dreams too vast for their small suburban family to hold. When their mother died after a long illness, Mahina abandoned them, leaving Jocelyn with their father in a cold house and a crumbling Dominic Tech on the brink of collapse. While Jocelyn knelt at their mother's workbench, writing her first lines of code to keep a promise to protect the family legacy, Mahina chose the glow of skyscrapers, prestigious business school lecture halls, and praise from strangers. She became their father's pride, the daughter he always mentioned with a beaming smile, though she hadn't stepped foot in the shop since their mother's death. Jocelyn didn't resent her. She was used to being forgotten, used to silently carrying everything. But when Mahina walked through Dominic Tech's door after a decade away, her high heels clicking on the floor like a war drum, it signaled a battle Jocelyn wasn't ready for. It was an autumn evening, golden leaves drifting outside the window, when Mahina appeared at the first family dinner in decades. She wore an expensive silk coat, her hair perfectly waved, and a confident smile as if she'd never left. "Dad, I think it's time I came back," she said, her voice soft but sharp like a gilded blade. "Dominic Tech is doing well, but I can take it to new heights." Jocelyn, stirring soup on the stove, the recipe their mother once made, felt her hand freeze, the heat from the pot searing her palm. She looked up, meeting her father's gaze. His eyes sparkled as if he'd just rediscovered a long-lost gem. "Mahina, you're right," he laughed, slapping the table. "You studied at a top business school, worked with the best. We need you." Jocelyn stood there, the soup ladle slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor, the sound blending with the cracking of her heart. She'd spent 10 years pouring sweat and tears into building Dominic Tech, but in a single moment, her father handed it to Mahina like an obvious gift. Mahina didn't take long to claim the spotlight. Just days after the dinner, their father called a family meeting, the first time he dubbed it a board meeting, and declared Mahina would be co-CEO alongside Jocelyn. "We need a professional image," he said, holding the coffee Jocelyn had brewed for him that morning. "Mahina has the degrees, the experience from big companies. She'll help us expand." Jocelyn sat across from him, hands clasped tightly under the table to hide their trembling. She wanted to scream that Mahina had never written a line of code, never stayed up all night fixing software bugs, never apologized to clients over system crashes. But she stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the old wooden table where she'd once carved her name and her mother's with a pencil sharpener as a child. Mahina looked at her, a slight smirk on her lips. "Jocelyn, you don't need to worry. I'll handle the big stuff. You just keep doing what you're good at, the techie things." The words stabbed at Jocelyn's pride, but she only nodded, swallowing the pain as she had countless unspoken grievances over the years. The weeks that followed were a quiet nightmare. Mahina brought tailored suits to the office, held investor meetings Jocelyn wasn't invited to, and posted glossy speeches on social media about a new vision for Dominic Tech. She hired a PR team, turning herself into the company's face while Jocelyn was relegated to the shadows, left with a desk buried in papers and lines of code. Once, Jocelyn overheard Mahina on the phone with a journalist. "I came back to save the family company from stagnation. We need innovation, not outdated methods." Jocelyn stood outside the door, her hand gripping the knob until her knuckles whitened. Outdated methods, those were the nights she stayed up fixing systems, the days she taught herself programming from borrowed library books, the times she turned down big city job offers to stay with her father and Dominic Tech. But now, Mahina stood atop the ashes of those sacrifices, building her own throne. The betrayal didn't hit all at once, it seeped in slowly, like water through a cracked wall. Jocelyn began to realize Mahina didn't just want power, she wanted to erase Jocelyn's mark on Dominic Tech entirely. One afternoon, as Jocelyn brought coffee to her father as usual, he looked up from papers Mahina had prepared, his gaze distracted. "Jocelyn, what do you think about changing the company logo?" "Mahina says it needs to be more modern." She froze, the hot coffee burning her hand. That logo was something she'd designed at 18, based on their mother's signature, a final memory she'd held onto. "Don't you remember, Dad?" she whispered, her voice catching. He shrugged. "Mahina says it's out of date." Jocelyn turned away, tears falling silently to the floor, but she didn't let him see. Inside her, a fire began to burn, not anger, but resolve. Mahina could take the spotlight, but she didn't know that beneath Jocelyn's quiet exterior lay a secret powerful enough to bring it all down, a promise to their mother, and a plan she'd been quietly preparing for years, waiting to unleash the Pandora's box the family had forgotten. In the days after Mahina swept into Dominic Tech like a whirlwind, Jocelyn began to sense a shift in the air, something stifling, like the damp earth before a heavy rain. Mahina didn't just bring flashy ideas, she carried an ambition too blatant to conceal, a blinding light that left their father dazzled and pushed Jocelyn deeper into the shadows than ever before. She tried to adapt, convincing herself she could share the fruits of her labor with her sister, that family ties could mend the growing cracks. But then the 25th anniversary gala for Dominic Tech arrived, and every illusion shattered like crystal crashing onto a cold stone floor. Mahina turned the event into a grand stage, not to honor their father or the company's journey, but to crown herself. She booked a 5-star hotel in the heart of the city, its glass walls reflecting the sparkle of crystal chandeliers and the laughter of the elite. Jocelyn arrived early, wearing a simple green dress she'd picked from a small shop near home, not to stand out, but to blend into the background, as she'd done for years. She moved through the tables, checking the guest list, ensuring everything was perfect, a habit from the days when Dominic Tech was just a tiny shop with a handful of regulars. Mahina arrived late, a vision in a fiery red gown, her gaze sweeping the room like a queen entering her court. She glanced at Jocelyn, her lips curling into a frigid smile. "You're not planning to keep that dress on, are you? This isn't a place for backstage people." Jocelyn forced a smile, her hand unconsciously clutching the hem of her dress, but she didn't reply, quietly stepping into a shadowed corner to escape the probing stares. The evening unfolded with handshakes, congratulations, and the clinking of wine glasses. Jocelyn stood near their father's table, watching him laugh heartily with investors Mahina had invited, people she'd never met in her decade of building the company. She felt like a ghost, present but invisible, in the very home she'd constructed from ruins. Then, as the clock struck 9, Mahina took the stage, the microphone gleaming in her hand like a scepter. The crowd fell silent, eyes fixed on her, and Jocelyn, standing near the emergency exit, felt a chill run down her spine. She sensed something was coming, but she couldn't have imagined it would cut deeper than any wound she'd ever known. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mahina began, her voice ringing out, confident and captivating, "today we don't just celebrate 25 years of Dominic Tech, we mark a new beginning." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Jocelyn with an odd glint. "I'm honored to announce that, as of this moment, I will be the sole CEO of Dominic Tech." Applause erupted, but Jocelyn felt the floor tilt beneath her. She looked to her father, waiting for him to object, but he only nodded, his lips pressed into a satisfied smile. Mahina pressed on, her voice rising, "The company has grown, but it's been held back by outdated thinking, by past mistakes we can't ignore." She turned fully toward Jocelyn, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Jocelyn, you know what I mean. That technical blunder of yours at 18, the software glitch that nearly bankrupted us. I'm here to fix what you broke." The room fell silent, then murmurs swelled like crashing waves. Jocelyn stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. A technical blunder? She remembered that year vividly, the year she'd discovered a flaw in their father's old system and fixed it over 3 sleepless days, saving the company from a crisis he hadn't even noticed. It wasn't her mistake, it was her first triumph. But now, Mahina had twisted it, painting her as a failure before hundreds of eyes staring at her with a mix of pity and disdain. She turned to her father, pleading with her gaze. "Dad, that's not true, you know it," but he only bowed his head, running a finger along his wineglass, then looked up with a slight nod. Mahina's right, sweetheart. We need change. His words pierced her heart like a bullet, not just for the betrayal, but for the indifference in his tone, as if she'd never been part of this journey. Mahina wasn't done. She stepped off the stage, closing the distance to Jocelyn, her voice dropping but loud enough for those nearby to hear. You should thank me for saving you from worse embarrassment. This company needs vision, not someone who just sits in a corner fixing machines. The crowd tittered, and Jocelyn's face burned, not with shame, but with a smoldering fire rising within her. She met Mahina's eyes, seeing not just arrogance but a deep-seated malice, as if Mahina had been waiting for this moment since they were children vying for their father's love after their mother's death. In that instant, a memory flooded back, the night their mother lay on her deathbed, her frail hand gripping Jocelyn's, whispering, "You're my light, don't let anyone snuff it out." The silver necklace, their mother's final gift, still rested in Jocelyn's pocket, cold and heavy. She reached in, touching it, and a decision flashed through her mind like lightning. She didn't cry or scream as Mahina might have expected. Instead, she walked to her father's table and placed the necklace before him, a silent gesture weightier than 1,000 words. "Congratulations, Dad," she said, her voice eerily calm, then turned and left the ballroom. Her shoes echoed on the marble floor, drowning out the whispers behind her, and as the doors closed, she heard Mahina's loud laugh. Finally, she knows her place. But Mahina didn't know that as Jocelyn stepped out of the gala's glow, she wasn't leaving in defeat. In her mind, a plan had taken shape, sharp and cold as a blade she'd honed for 10 years. The necklace wasn't a goodbye to her father, it was a promise to her mother, a vow that she'd take everything back, not with tears, but with a strength no one in that room could fathom. That night, she didn't go home. She drove straight to the Dominic Tech office, unlocked the door with a spare key her father had forgotten she kept, and sat down in front of the computer, where she'd once built everything from nothing with her own 2 hands. The blue glow of the screen illuminated her face, her red-rimmed eyes not from tears but from fierce concentration. Jocelyn began typing, each keystroke a brick in the plan she'd quietly constructed for years, not for revenge, but to reclaim what was hers. First, she opened a file of share records stored in an encrypted folder on her private server. 10 years ago, when Dominic Tech needed capital to expand, her father had sold 6% of his shares to her, a transaction he'd signed hastily while distracted by one of Mahina's award ceremonies. He hadn't read the fine print, and now, with 51% of the shares in her possession, Jocelyn held the real control. She gave a faint smile, not out of joy, but at the irony, her father had handed her the key to power without ever realizing it. But that was just the beginning. Jocelyn switched to another account, Innovate Labs, a secret company she'd founded under her mother's name 5 years ago, when she realized Dominic Tech wasn't just her father's dream but her promise to her mother. The flagship software, responsible for 80% of the company's revenue, didn't belong to Dominic Tech, it belonged to Innovate Labs, with a licensing agreement set to expire at midnight tonight. She'd sent her father a renewal contract last week, but he'd left it buried under a pile of papers, preoccupied with Mahina's gala plans. Jocelyn hovered her finger over the enter key, hesitating for a second, then pressed it. The contract officially lapsed, and Dominic Tech no longer had rights to the software she'd poured her sweat and tears into creating. Next came a move even she hadn't expected to use. She opened an old document, stored on a personal hard drive from the days when Mahina was an ambitious 18-year-old. It was a contract relinquishing Mahina's inheritance rights to Dominic Tech shares, an agreement she'd signed with their father to fund her college tuition, forfeiting any claim to the family company. Their father had forgotten, Mahina didn't remember, but Jocelyn, with the sharp memory of a programmer, had kept it as her ace in the hole. She scanned the document and sent it to her private lawyer with a brief note, "Be ready." Mahina might be their father's pride, but she had no legal standing to claim a seat at Dominic Tech. At 3 a.m., as the city slept, Jocelyn sent a mass email to every major client, partner, and employee of Dominic Tech. The message was concise but cutting. "I, Jocelyn, am announcing a leadership change at Dominic Tech and my decision to step away from the company. Innovate Labs will continue serving you with the same quality and commitment." She attached the software contract termination notice and an invitation for the tech team, people she'd trained and bonded with like a second family, to join Innovate Labs. Her phone buzzed with replies, messages from tech team leads saying, "We're with you." Emails from Dominic Tech's biggest clients rolled in, "We're terminating our contracts with Dominic Tech. Please contact us via Innovate Labs." Each notification was a hammer strike, smashing the empire Mahina thought she'd secured. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the office windows as Mahina and their father walked in, their faces glowing with the imagined triumph of the previous night. Mahina spotted Jocelyn at the conference table, holding a tablet, and frowned. "What are you doing here? I thought you'd already slunk away." Their father cut in, his voice stern. "Jocelyn, enough. Mahina's CEO now." Jocelyn looked up, her eyes calm but icy. "Is she? I think we should review a few things." She activated the tablet, projecting the share contract onto the big screen, 51% in her name. Their father blanched. Mahina let out a forced laugh. "Forged." Dad would never, but Jocelyn interrupted, displaying Mahina's inheritance waiver next. "You signed this at 18, Mahina. You have no rights here." The room grew heavy as lead. Jocelyn continued, her voice steady but commanding. "The flagship software? It belongs to Innovate Labs, and the contract expired last night. Our biggest clients have terminated their agreements. The best tech team has agreed to join me." She unlocked her phone and played a recording, her mother's faint but clear voice, "Jocelyn, you're my strength, don't let anyone take that away." Their father sank into a chair, tears streaming down his face, the first time in years he'd looked at her with pain and regret. Mahina screamed, "You're a traitor," but her voice cracked in desperation as her phone buzzed with a message from Jocelyn's lawyer, documents verified as valid. Jocelyn stood, stepping close to her father, resting a hand on his shoulder for a moment before pulling back. "I didn't betray anyone," she said, her voice light as a breeze. "I just took back what's mine." She looked at Mahina, her eyes no longer angry but resolute. "You played this game, Mahina, but you didn't know the rules." As Jocelyn stepped out of the conference room, the early morning sunlight streamed through Dominic Tech's large glass windows, casting streaks of light on the floor like paths leading to a future she'd never dared to dream of. Mahina's screams and their father's pained silence still echoed in her mind, but she didn't look back. She'd laid everything on the line, truth, loyalty, and the scars her family had carved into her heart, and now she stood at the crossroads of a victory that wasn't as sweet as she'd once imagined. Mahina thought she'd secured the crown, but she didn't know it was forged from Jocelyn's sweat and tears, and no one could take it without paying a price. In the now empty meeting room, a new storm was brewing, and Jocelyn, though reluctantly, had become its captain. She sat down in her office, not the small corner desk where she'd toiled for 10 years, but the large one on the top floor, where her father once sat with dreams that never came to fruition. On the desk was a small framed photo of her and her mother from a summer afternoon, when her mother was still healthy and taught her to fold paper cranes. Jocelyn touched the frame, her fingers tracing her mother's smile, and whispered, "I did it, Mom." But this victory didn't bring full joy. It was like a glass of bitter wine, fragrant but leaving a lingering aftertaste. She'd forced her father and Mahina to face the truth, but the cost was the complete severing of already fragile family ties. Mahina didn't accept defeat gracefully. In the hours after the meeting, she spiraled into a frenzy, calling lawyers, sending threatening emails to partners, scrambling to salvage her image. But every door slammed shut. The major clients, once charmed by her smile and speeches, now responded with curt emails, "We choose to work with Innovate Labs." The tech team, who'd bonded with Jocelyn through long nights fixing software bugs, signed with her without hesitation. By day's end, Mahina stood outside Dominic Tech, her high heels now dusty, her eyes no longer haughty but filled with bewilderment. She peered through the glass, seeing Jocelyn speaking with a group of employees, and for the first time, she realized she'd underestimated the sister she'd once called invisible. Their father, meanwhile, chose silence. He didn't call or text, just quietly left the office with slumped shoulders. Jocelyn heard from an employee that he'd gone to their old family home, where they'd lived when her mother was still alive, and sat for hours on the porch bench, staring into space. She didn't know what he was thinking, regret for misplaced trust, or just the sorrow of a father who'd lost both daughters. Part of her wanted to run to him, hug him, and say she still loved him despite everything. But another part, the one hurt too deeply, held her back. She couldn't forgive easily, not now, with the wound still bleeding. That afternoon, Jocelyn called an emergency meeting with Dominic Tech's remaining staff. She stood before them, not as a victim or a victor, but as a leader who knew the road ahead. "I won't promise glitz or praise," she said, her voice steady yet powerful, "but I promise to build a better Dominic Tech with you, where everyone is respected for what they do." The room erupted in applause, not for show, but because they saw in her a fire Mahina never had, the flame of sincerity and resolve. Then came an unexpected twist, like lightning in a clear sky. While checking her email, Jocelyn received a message from a major competitor of Dominic Tech. Its contents stunned her. "We know about Mahina's plan to sell the company. If you want to collaborate to stop this, contact us now." She immediately dug into the internal system and uncovered a hidden email chain Mahina had sent from her personal account, negotiating to sell 30% of Dominic Tech shares to the rival for a pittance, in exchange for a board position. The plan had been set in motion just before the gala, a backup for Mahina if she couldn't seize control. Jocelyn sat still, not in anger, but in profound sadness. Mahina hadn't just wanted to steal her credit, she was willing to destroy their parents' legacy to protect her ego. She forwarded the email to her lawyer with a brief note, "Release if necessary." But she didn't act yet. Instead, she called Mahina, her voice eerily calm. "You have 1 day to leave the city," she said. "Otherwise, everyone will know what you planned for Dominic Tech." Mahina didn't reply, only her sharp breaths audible before the line went dead. The next morning, Jocelyn learned Mahina had booked a flight to a distant city, leaving without a goodbye. Their father, in a rare moment, sent her a text, "You were right, I was wrong." She read it, then locked her phone without responding. Someday, she might talk to him, but not today. As dusk fell, Jocelyn stood alone on Dominic Tech's top floor, gazing at the city lighting up below. She didn't feel like a winner, but she felt free from expectations, lies, and the shadow of a family that had weighed her down too long. She opened a drawer, pulled out an old paper crane her mother had folded, and placed it beside the photo frame. "Mom, I kept my promise," she whispered, and for the first time in years, she smiled without a trace of strain. Dominic Tech was hers now, not just on paper, but in every beat of her heart, and she knew, from here, she'd build something greater, not to prove anything, but to live true to herself. The last sunset Jocelyn watched from the top floor of Dominic Tech was like a farewell to the past, but when the sun rose the next morning, she stood before a new horizon. A year had passed since she wrested the company from Mahina and their father, and Dominic Tech didn't just survive, it soared into a beacon of the tech industry, reaching a valuation of $150 million. The lines of code she'd once written at her mother's workbench had become the backbone of new products, from smart management software to AI systems that help thousands of small businesses, places like the Dominic Tech of old, weather their storms. Her name appeared in business magazines, not with flowery praise, but as a living story of a woman who turned broken pieces into diamonds. Yet for Jocelyn, success wasn't about numbers or the spotlight, it was the peace she found when she looked in the mirror and no longer saw the shadow of doubt. Mahina, after leaving the city in silence, became an ellipsis in Jocelyn's life. Rumors swirled that she'd tried her luck at a startup in some distant place, but the artificial glow she'd once cultivated had dissipated like morning mist under the sun. Once, at a tech conference, Jocelyn overheard a colleague mention Mahina with a tone tinged with pity. "She thought she could buy the world, but now she's just a whisper." Jocelyn didn't laugh or feel smug, she simply walked away, her heart as light as when she released a paper crane into a river. Their father, meanwhile, retreated into seclusion. He sent her a gift at Christmas, a small wooden box containing letters their mother had written before her death, which he'd kept hidden for years. Jocelyn opened them, reading each trembling line, "You're the strongest wind I've ever known." She cried, not from pain, but because she finally understood that her mother's love had never left her, even as her father and Mahina tried to dim its light. A small surprise arrived one rainy afternoon when her assistant brought her an unmarked envelope. Inside was an invitation to speak at a prestigious business school, Mahina's alma mater, on the topic, "The Power of the Underestimated." Jocelyn laughed, a rare, clear sound amid her busy days. She imagined Mahina sitting somewhere in the audience, her face stiffening as Jocelyn recounted her journey, not to mock, but to remind everyone that sometimes, the one deemed weakest writes history. She accepted, not to boast, but to share with young people the lesson her mother taught her: true worth lies not in what others see, but in what you dare to stand up for. As night fell, Jocelyn often sat alone in her office, the city lights twinkling through the window like the stars her mother once pointed out in the sky. She no longer kept her mother's necklace in her pocket, it now rested on her desk beside the last paper crane her mother had folded, a reminder that she'd emerged from darkness to find her own light. Her family had once been a shattered painting, but she no longer tried to piece it back together. Instead, she painted a new one, not for revenge, but to live, to breathe, and to become the version her mother always believed she could be. Dominic Tech was more than a company, it was proof that sometimes, the most powerful way to answer those who underestimate you is to rise so high they have no choice but to look up. In the twilight of life, we often look back with regrets and lessons. Jocelyn teaches us that, even if forgotten or underestimated, you can still find the strength to rise, like an ancient tree standing firm after a storm. Don't wait for others to recognize your worth, affirm it through your actions, however small they may be. Family can be a pillar of support, but also a challenge. Learn to let go of hurt to find peace. Ultimately, success isn't about revenge, but about living fully as yourself, like a lamp that shines despite the surrounding darkness. Let old age be a harvest of resilience, not a burden of the past.